It is always a pleasure and a privilege to sit in for George Norrie on the best in overnight talk radio. Thank you for joining me on Coast to Coast AM. I'm Dave Schrader, your host for the evening. When we return, our evening of true crime will continue. Our guest, Sondra London, next, right here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast AM. Sitting in for George Norrie, I'm Dave Schrader. Joining me for the last 2 hours of this evening's show, Sondra London. She's published Confessions of Serial Killers and researched some of the most depraved criminal minds of our time. And after 24 years of studying the real-life monsters in cages where Murder Road comes to a dead end, Sondra declares that nothing in the true crime genre compares to the vivid and intimate account in her new book, Good Little Soldiers, a memoir of true horror. Welcome to Coast AM, Sondra London. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Sondra.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Fascinating book, fascinating concept on this, and I want to get into it, but let's give the audience a little bit of your background. Why serial killers? What was your fascination with investigating true crime?
Sure. Let's start with 1989.
Okay.
And I had been a technical writer and writing manuals for the high-tech industry, and I've been doing this since before we had Windows and mouses and that kind of thing. And so, then evidently Reaganomics kicked in that year, and I started losing contracts and wonder what in the world is wrong. I'm not getting the work. Well, I didn't realize it was the whole economy, but at any rate, at that same time, they executed Ted Bundy, and everyone made such a fuss over it, and talking about Ted Bundy and serial killers. And I said, well, heck, I knew a serial killer. And I picked up that Anne Rule book about Ted Bundy, read that, and I felt that, first of all, I could write a lot better than she did, and secondly, that I had a lot more of a story than she did. So I says, what the heck? And I wrote to Schaefer and said, do you want to do a book? Gerard John Schaefer had been my boyfriend when I was in high school, and we were together for a year, and that was in 1964. And 9 years later, he had become a sheriff's deputy, and long and the short of it was that he was convicted of killing 2 girls and connected with 32 dead or missing girls or women, and that was Schaefer. So that had happened 9 years after I knew him. And then that was in the 70s. And
how did he respond to that when you reached out asking if you wanted to share his story? Was he forthcoming at first, or did it take a little cajoling to get him to come on board?
He'd been in prison 16 years. And when I got deep into his case, I found papers that were, seized as part of evidence, in which he wrote to his mother about me. From all that far back in his history, he was still thinking and fascinated with me. And so then when I contacted him after he was sitting there in prison for 16 years, he was pretty excited. And I wrote to him, how do you remember me? And he wrote back, how could I forget you? I loved you with a cold blue flame, right? So we embarked upon a enterprise there, and that became quite involved because he wasn't just a regular serial killer. He'd gotten a degree in criminal justice and a degree in creative writing, and he'd written up these fantastical articles that he kept and that were used as evidence to convict him of murder. So my quest to deal with his story became very much involved in dealing with his writing, because in the process of I'm trying to get his story, and I said, that stuff you wrote, do you still write it? And he said, boy, do I, right? So we were engaged in the writing of new material at that time. The book did contain some of the original material that was seized, and then material that he wrote during our collaboration. Eventually, it became quite a trip because Schaefer had two completely different stories that contradicted each other. He was both an innocent framed cop and the greatest, those are his words, serial killer of women in our century. And then now, here's me trying to collaborate with what is your story? And you put a story in writing and it doesn't change, but he changes. And in his mind, you need to be on the same page he's on. And never mind that it's the opposite side of the page he was on, 1 hour ago. So that became my introduction to dealing with a person that has more than one ego state or way of being. And we'll get into this. This is a theme that carries through to my current work, Good Little Soldiers. So that's important, learning that I picked up from that experience.
Let me ask you real quickly. You had dated this man. Was there, in hindsight, did you ever look back and think, ooh, these were some signs. I don't know how I missed that at the time.
Oh, it's more than that. I mean, it's all in the book, Killer Fiction, the story of my trip through that particular case. But, there was more. He confessed to me that he wanted to kill women at the time. He told me he wanted to kill women. And he told me of a plan he had made to kill a woman on his block that was foiled when his father came by and said, John, what are you doing there?
Now, did you take his stories at first as though he was just being goofy or just trying to get attention? Or did you take him
when we were
as
teenagers?
Yeah, when he was saying these things.
He told me these things.
Yes.
He was distraught. He wasn't fun anymore.
Well, obviously,
he
right.
was going to pieces. I was not a therapist. I never heard of any such thing. The word serial killer had not been invented. We'd never had our Ted Bundy. We'd never had our John Wayne Gacy. And people say things all the time. And you don't really, in your farthest imagination, think, oh, here I am talking to one of the, criminology's great criminal figures. And, oh, my, he's really going to kill someone, maybe me. No, that never crossed my mind.
So even though he was talking about the wanton desire to murder.
Yeah, but he was a kind of a sappy, saggy kind of a fail kind of a personality at that point. Not a menacing, powerful,
well, then why did you stay with him?
Guy, right?
why did you stay with him if he was that kind of way and then on top of it he was making comments like that? Or is that what ended your relationship?
I was done.
Okay, so once he started talking to you about that, that's when you bailed out of that relationship.
Yeah, it wasn't 1, 2, 3 like that, but it had the same timing.
Okay.
He was going on like that. I got a new boyfriend. He didn't. He was no more fun, and I never thought anything about it. But I also need to say that in view of what he became and what went on the record, I need to go ahead and say that he was never abnormal with me. He never wanted to treat me to any weird sex or strange behavior. He was just as normal as he could be.
Then
that was Schaefer.
Right,
and then that was what got me interested in being a true crime writer, because I said, okay, all my writing is just going into business publications, and I want to do something that I can put my name on and that people will be interested in. So I questioned myself, what are people interested in? I looked at the TV guide, and I see murder this, followed by killer that. And I look down the TV guide and I hardly see anything else. And I say, well, clearly America's fascinated with violence and crime. So let's just start with that, since that's practically all I see listed here on the TV guide. And so that was my decision, because it was a decision to stop writing about computers and start writing something someone was interested in. I knew Schaefer, and so tag you're it. So it wasn't any obsession on my part, and it never has been.
All right, and the idea that, you go in and you start making communication with this man, he starts opening up to you and sharing bits of this information. Was that hard for you as somebody who had him as a part of your life at some point to have those revelations coming out? Or did you just try to keep yourself separated from the concept of your relationship with him and who he had become?
Well, it's a good question. Let me see if I can shed a little light on my process. I came from an education from a school called New College in Florida that stressed independent research, and that we learned how to structure a study and pursue it. That was the kind of education that I came from. So I knew I had to go from the particular to the general. I contacted the experts in the field, and I contacted the FBI, and I said, I'm going to be working with a serial killer. I need all the help I can get. And they said, you need to talk to Roy Hazelwood. And they were just like that. They put me in touch with probably at least one of the world's most preeminent experts in serial killers, certainly serial sexual violence. And he became my personal mentor. And Roy Hazelwood, I had his home phone number, and we corresponded. We talked on the phone, and he invited me to be a special guest at the law enforcement seminars he put on. And so there was my backup right there, my whole resource and training. And he had put me in touch. I was in Georgia with the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, Ralph Stone, who was their local expert in profiling, and we worked very closely, and they helped me. The first thing that Roy Hazelwood told me is, don't give them anything personal. They will use it as a weapon. The second thing was, don't show any reaction. He's trying to get a reaction from you. And no matter how hard it is, when you deal with them, you have to be completely blasé and unfazed. So that, I took those directions very, very seriously. And so from then on, in all of my dealings. And so with Schaefer, that had the result of getting him to continually try harder and harder to shock me and offend me and make me react. To myself, as just a person, I'm not an FBI agent. My training is just conversation. I didn't go years of grueling experience or anything. I was just very, very, very average, a lay person. In fact, more sensitive because of being in the arts. And so this was all really, really hardcore. And I was in shock. And most of the time I was working, peering through my fingers and really not wanting to even see it at all. But I encouraged him because it was, as I say to myself, more data. So that book there, Killer Fiction, amounts to an interaction between this very bright, very perverted and devious and degenerate and pure evil man and the object of his practically lifelong obsession, him trying to really virtually assault me with his writing. And that's what that book is. When you read it, it's palpably assaultive. Well, by the time I got all that material, that was a whole book, so I didn't really develop it in anything like that, what you would think an Ann Rule would do with it. I just said, that's it.
And then we've only got a few minutes left in this segment. Then you met with another serial killer and started on another journey, correct?
All right. It's a little more complicated. Other people in the prison system became aware of my work, contacted me, and asked me to work with them, in particular Bobby Lewis, who had escaped from Death Row number 1 and who'd been on death row with Ted Bundy number 2. I took Bobby Lewis on, so when Danny Rolling was arrested and brought into the prison, they put him there with Bobby Lewis, who then showed Danny Rolling my work that I'd done on Bobby Lewis's escape from death row. And Danny Rolling said, aha, this is the person I want to work with on my life story. And so Danny Rolling contacted me.
Is it hard to interact with these people knowing what their mind is like? Once you've got a couple of these under your belt, did you ever get the feeling of, you know what, this is maybe not, I like writing, I like the research, but face-to-face with killers, maybe this is a different career option?
You're absolutely right about that. It's really depressing. It's sordid. It's dangerous. And I'm sure for people who are oriented that way, they could make it profitable, but I have not oriented that way, and it has not been profitable to me.
Okay. Then why continue on with it?
I'm not.
Well, you've got...
We're talking about things that went on 20, 30 years ago.
Right, but you're still an author, and you're still researching true crime. I just wondered, with dealing with that, is you've taken yourself out of the vein of necessarily dealing with the killer directly, and now just covering stories as they're told.
Now I'm working with a victim, an intimate victim of a serial killer.
Now, you worked with 2 serial killers, and that was a dark, dirty atmosphere, and yet you still said that after 24 years of studying real-life monsters, this story that you cover in Good Little Soldiers, nothing compares to what this story was and how it unfolded for you.
I will stand by that.
Frightening stuff. That's what we're going to cover when the show continues here. Again, if you're interested in the guests, we always have the links up. You can go check out Coast to Coast AM. You can get a good look at what our upcoming guests are, our past guests, information, links, and ways to find their books, their websites, and more. So I encourage you to check that out. And while you're there, make sure you check out to become a Coast Insider. You can sign up and get your subscription for a 1-year subscription. Again, only 15 cents a day. That's all it takes. And you can check all that information out on the site. And while you're there, check out paranormaldate.com. You may find your new best friend or the love of your life. George Norrie knows that people are looking for loved ones and new best friends and people to share their ideas and opinions and thoughts with. And now it's a like-minded situation where you can all meet together under one common umbrella. ParanormalDate.com, over 60,000 members strong. Sign up for free and check it out for yourself. We'll be back with more of the best in overnight talk radio. I'm Dave Schrader, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Thank you very much for joining me. George told me to make sure you know if you're interested in true crime, you can join me every Tuesday with our podcast, True Crime Tuesday, as we explore some of the most unusual true crimes from around the world. And we always fill in with a little fun and laughter at the end with some dumb crimes and stupid criminals. For more information and to subscribe, you could check out my website at darknessradio.com and click on the True Crime Tuesday banner. Again, go to darknessradio.com and click on the True Crime Tuesday banner and get access to all of our archives and be a member and a paid subscriber, and that way you'll never miss another minute in the best in true crime talk radio. Thank you very much, George, for allowing me to mention that on the air. Something else we're doing in partnership with Coast to Coast AM. Every year, our show deals with Halloween for Hunger. We help raise money for Second Harvest Heartland, which is an amazing organization and has such a buying power that every $1 we raise supplies 3 full meals to a person in need. You heard that right. $1. $1 cost of a newspaper, I can get 3 meals for a person in need. Last year, with your help, we raised over $13,800. We're back at it again this year, and we could use your help. If you're interested in helping, then email me, dave@darknessradio.com, dave@darknessradio.com, and I'll send you a link so you can make a donation. Any size donation helps. Even $1 will go to feed one person for an entire day. If we can hit our goal of $15,000 by the end of our program on the first weekend in November, we will have supplied 45,000 meals to people in need here in the United States, in the heartland of America. So please help us out. Just email me, dave@darknessradio.com, and I'll send you that link, and you can do some due diligence and research on Second Harvest Heartland for yourself. But it's a great organization, and we've done this for numerous years on our show, and Coast to Coast partnered with us a few years ago to help us do this as well. So we thank them for their continued support for the community and the world around us and just making things better. All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk with our guest about the new book that she's written, and she says is truly a story that unfolds and is even more bizarre and terrifying than anything she's talked about in the past. Good Little Soldiers, a memoir of true horror, with our guest Sondra London when we return to Coast AM. Sondra London, my guest for the remainder of the show. Sondra, talk to me about Good Little Soldiers, a memoir of true horror. You went from dealing with serial killers directly to dealing with a victim here in this story. How did this story come to your attention?
All right. Along the way, I've been doing quite a lot of work with video production, with documentaries, and I was affiliated for 15 years with a filmmaker located in London, England, and then under his sponsorship was researching mind control, and went to a conference in 2003 of survivors of United States government mind control programs. And it was at that conference that I met Stephen Griggs. At that conference, I was able to do quite a few interviews, and in the course of my work on this documentary, in fact, there were 80,000 words transcribed from interviews I did with push-button killers or people who are like Diane. I would call roadkill on the MK highway. In other words, these programs were intentional to create, the push-button killers, really, ultimately. But also, along the way, they interfered with thousands of lives in different ways. And for the most part, just went on and left these people behind, and I will call that roadkill on the MK highway, and would also count people like Ted Kaczynski in that. So anyway, that's how I met Dianne Fitzpatrick's brother, Stephen Griggs. And Stephen followed up by sending me a box of material, which, you would say, like if it was a stack of papers, it was about, 8 inches tall, a box full of documentation of research he'd done into his father. In that package was a typescript with the title MKUltra, and it was written by Diane. And that was the only thing among those papers that really hinted on that end of what went on there. Most of what was covered in the case regarded the homicidal maniac father and his predations. But behind that was another story that when John Edgerton did a documentary on Diane and Stephen's stories about their father, he would not touch the MKUltra part, the things that happened in the lab and so on. He wouldn't touch it, and neither would, and in the end, the documentary I was working on, it was funded, and the National Geographic picked up the option, held it for a year, and then let it expire, and then went on and did a documentary on mind control from a, shall we say, a different point of view.
Now, talk to me about this. You start going through this information, Sondra, and you're looking at it. And, I mean, we've heard about it on Coast to Coast, certainly over the years, and on other shows like this, and our show, MKUltra, mind control, these possibilities. In some ways, it just sounds too fantastical to be true. But as you're reading this and researching it and looking at this papers, tell me what your initial reaction is to the findings.
Well, let's jump right in on it. Looks too fantastical to be true.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's an important part of the research I've done and the writing I've done, the teaching I've done in this book, which I included at the end. And that's an analysis of some of these linguistic weapons that have been contrived to protect deadly secrets. In other words, these are devices that work automatically and in perpetuity. They don't have to be manned. They automatically work. I call them shields because they invisibly repel investigation of crimes. Now, in this case, I call this one the shield of incredibility. And in that case, we'll have factors that are difficult or impossible to believe. The classic example of the way this has been perpetrated is when the operatives will dress up like aliens or witches, or they might don a white rabbit costume, as Louis Julian West was known to do when he was putting children through traumatic programming. And so, therefore, when the person tries to talk about what happened to them, immediately the shield of incredibility is thrown up around that entire witness. And from then on, everything they have to say is discredited because it's considered tainted by incredibility. Okay, that's one of the shields. I go on to discuss a couple of other ones, but I would like to say that this is not an accident. This is built in.
Right, so there's this plausible deniability. Listen, how can this be true? I mean, there was a giant white rabbit or there was an alien. It just makes everything that this person's about to say sound insane, and the credibility factor goes out the window. Right.
Anyone who continues to listen to that witness will also suffer that the person like myself, the writer or the investigator, who listens to these stories then becomes tainted by, quite frankly, saying that they are crazy and you are crazy too for listening to them. Now, I want you to realize I'm very well aware that there are crazy people. There are crazy things, and quite often things that are incredible are that way because they're not true. And that's our common sense world that we live in, and that we're taught to experience because we go on our experience, and that most people go their entire life without encountering anything that is contradictory to that basic principle. But once you start out by saying someone that you've known intimately for years also has a secret life of perversion and crime on the side, and you have absolutely no idea about it, and once you've dealt with something like that, you have to begin to understand that there are ways that perception works, and there are ways that the mind works. And there's a phenomenon that Diane, my co-author, pointed out to me. Things are secret, or as they say, occult or secret, not because an effort is made to hide them, but because people do not want to know.
Why do you think it's that people don't want to know? Because it's just too horrific to begin to even comprehend?
Into the shield of repugnance.
Okay.
Things can be done that are so disgusting that the witness is inhibited from reporting them. This has been done to me. Things have been perpetrated to me that I can't talk about because they're too disgusting. And when you report something disgusting, that disgusting information comes from your mouth. And from then on, it is always linked to you. And so, therefore, it rebounds against you as the witness or victim, that you're the one who's bringing that bad subject into the conversation. Okay?
All right.
So that effect works as well. And the shield of repugnance comes in place when something is so disgusting that you naturally recoil from it. You say, I'm just not that kind of person. Y'all take care of this. I got something else to do.
Right.
I don't like to, or what did Barbara Bush say? I don't want to spoil my beautiful mind with things like that. So if you are going to perpetrate things and you embed in them elements that are so repugnant that the witness is afraid or upset to even mention them, that will enable you to continue to perpetrate these crimes. That will cover them up in advance. That's premeditation.
Talk to me about the children involved in this story. And when you're talking with them about this horrific crime, what was their lives like early on? Was it normal or were things always bizarre?
You mean with Diane and Stephen?
Yes.
Oh. Diane is my source. Stephen is her brother. Stephen's 3 years older than Diane. All right? And our story in the book begins when Diane is 6 years old. And her father and mother take her and Stephen down to the base, to an office where they live on base. Take them down there and sign them up for a special program. That is where our book begins. Now, in real life, we have a story that goes back generations. And just to not dwell on this too much, but Diane comes from a family that has shamanistic tendencies on both sides. On her father's side, one of the great-grand dams was a shaman in Siberia, a Siberian shaman, and was there when the Tunguska event happened in 1918, and a meteor wiped out her village, and she was blinded, and she had to walk and find her way to civilization after that. She had to live with reindeer, and so that came down, and Diane's family, and a lot of the abilities that come with that would be in her genetics. On her mother's side, they were Lenni Lenape, or Delaware Indians. And great-grandfather's grandmother was a shaman in that persuasion. So coming down through there was shape-shifting. There was different levels of reality involved. Now we come to Dad. Dad was born in 1912 in America, in Boston, to the Lithuanian parents, and then was only here for 3 months, and then the mother took him back to Lithuania where he grew up. When he became 17, it was 1929, and he had to come back to America to keep his citizenship. This is 1929, and he was in Lithuania. So he set out on foot to find his way across Europe to come to America. He had an aunt, Magda, who was sending him money, but for him to get where he had to go, he had to walk. Walking through Poland or Germany, he came to a concentration camp, and he approached the camp and was socializing with a girl on the other side of the fence when the guards came and caught him. they gave him a choice which side of the fence he wanted to be on. And the people inside the fence were prisoners and outside were the guards, and he chose to stay with the guards. So from then on, he was a collaborator with the Nazis. This is before he was 17. He would tell these stories to his wife while the children would just have to, eavesdrop. This is how Diane learned these things. He told of the time when they lined up a bunch of prisoners and made them dig their own pit, stood them up in front of the pit and shot them all, but they weren't all dead. And the commander said he didn't want to waste any more bullets, so he gave Sylvestrus a knife and told him to slit the throats of the dying in the pits. And when he was done, he was covered with blood, and he told his wife, he said, I prayed if there was a God that I wouldn't wake up in the morning. And then when he did wake up, he said he knew there was no God.
Oh, horrific.
So bringing this kind of a background, he came to the United States and went to New York and became a butcher. And then he went to work for the CCC, which was Civilian Conservation Corps, which started in 1933. He went in the Army for 2 years, did a stretch, and got out. Now, it was 1939 when he went back in the Army the second time, and at this point, they said he had to change his name. His Lithuanian name was Sylvestris Griggs. At the time he reenlisted in 1939, they said it had to be Stephen Griggs. He changed and went to work in the Army as a cook and married Mom.
And why was the name change so important?
Well, he needed to be more American now.
Okay.
And to flash forward about 1 million years in debriefing after he was dead and everything with the FBI people, it was revealed to Diane and Stephen that he had a very complicated dossier suitable for a double agent with his dual citizenship. So that is his deep background, and that places him there in the Army. Our story begins, Diane is 6. They're living in Fort Devens.
And this starts to take a very bizarre twist. And, I mean, when we talk about bizarre, you start to hear the story, and you're reading through these notes and hearing from her directly. At any point, do you just say, this just cannot be true? There's no way this kind of depravity and weirdness could be real.
Hold that thought,
okay,
Dave, and focus on that. And imagine being treated that way. And that's what I call the true horror of this story.
We have to take a break, and we'll come back after the top of the hour. We have a whole nother hour with our guest, Good Little Soldiers, a memoir of true horror. I'm working with a couple of production companies. One is looking for your story right now. If you've had horrific paranormal encounters or abduction, and you'd like to share that in a 1-hour format for a brand new series that is filming for a major network, you can email me your name, your contact information, and a brief introduction to you and your story, and I'll pass it on to the production company. Send that on to me at dave@darknessradio.com. Stay tuned. We've got more coming your way here on the best in overnight talk radio. For George Norrie, I'm Dave Schrader, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Thank you for joining me this evening. Sondra London, our guest for the remainder of the show. Sondra has appeared on national and international television dozens of times. She was the focus of a 2000 biopic by Errol Morris that aired in his first-person series in the UK and USA. Sondra produced 5 exclusive stories for A Current Affair and associate-produced a 2012 documentary, My Brother, the Serial Killer, best known for her studies of serial killers. She also co-authored The Making of a Serial Killer and Killer Fiction. Her new book, Good Little Soldiers, a memoir of true horror, is told to her by Dianne Fitzpatrick, and we've been hearing this very strange story start to unfold. All right. Now that we've got the basics and the groundwork for the story laid out, explain to me what starts to happen to these children and how this turns into a real, just unbelievable nightmare.
The things that were happening to Diane and Stephen in real life started before the point where the book begins. Let me just say a word about this as a book, if you don't mind.
Sure.
This is a memoir of true horror. It's true. And it's about crime, yet it's not true crime, because true crime is a genre that's defined by having headlines, right? And that's the marketing structure for true crime, is that it's, ripped from the headlines. This is not that kind of a story. Because our perpetrator was never convicted of any crime. And so therefore you don't have the classic structure of a true crime book where you reasonably expect the forces of good to triumph, right? And there's a cop and it's solved, and then the whole book itself is laid out in terms of what enters into the public record of a trial. So therefore, working with this type of material is a completely new challenge for me. Over the course of from 2003 until the time I finally came out with this book, I dealt with it for years in terms of, I can't do it because I can't prove it, because there's a firewall on true crime journalism. And I just felt like, I can't do it. And yet years went by, and I couldn't forget it. And I was so touched by Diane's character and these children and the incredible journey they went through as a story. And then also, as all of the things that I became aware of about his criminal history, it was quite a education in terms of a case history. When I started out, I was putting it together almost like a true crime, like a case history. It had everything in it. I had to take half of it out because it can only be one book long. And so what remains from the work that I did is a story. It's a tale. It's like a fairy tale. It's like a story. It's told in the voice of Diane. And Diane is a 6-year-old child, very sensitive and very imaginative, and in fact has learned to dissociate because of the trauma she's had to live with. So the writing has to reflect that. It's written in her voice, from her point of view. So things that were going on there that could only be brought to the reader with a different voice, they're not there, okay? In fact, many times they've been taken out. Because this makes it a book, and it flows, and it has a storyline, and it has a voice. So that's what I wanted to say about, bringing this material to life as a book. I was mostly concerned that it be readable, and for that, much of it has been taken out. But at the same time, I'm prepared to talk about the real people involved and, everything I know about it. In fact, what I told you earlier about his father and the pit, that's not in the book. It's just part of my research. So I'm prepared to talk any way you want about what really happened, or, kind of like how does the book go, or...
We'll cover that when we return then. Yes. Talk to me about how the book goes and any bits of information, even that you didn't include in the book. But, I want you to evolve the story for us in the remaining time we have together. We'll do that when we return. Sondra London, our guest here on Coast to Coast AM. Sondra London, our guest for the remainder of the show. Good Little Soldiers is the name of the book. You can find more information at goodlittlesoldiers.com. All right. Now that we've got the setup going here, please walk us through this history of what happens to the children. Now that we know about the parents, what starts to happen to the children involved in this case?
I wish I had, 5 hours.
Right.
And it being a story, and there being so many murders. And so I'd like to just quickly run you through one episode that was important in the story and in life. And let's just say that when I tell you this part here, already in the book, you've seen 4 or 5 murders already. And this would involve the father taking the children with him and making them a part of what he did on the murder. Okay, so
how old were they? How old were they when he started taking them with on these murders?
Well, Stephen, he didn't really. The first murder that affected Stephen was only about 4, and it was a little boy that was 2, and Diane was just an infant. So that was the first one that.
What was the rationale, do you believe, for him taking the children
several.
with?
One of them was to coarsen them, and he hoped to bring them along as accomplices and trainees. He also hoped to intimidate them and use this as a threat. In other words, if I can do this here, I can do this to you. So that to ensure compliance and control. But he was always like he was giving a class or something. Now, you always do this, you always do that, and the 2 children were quite different. Diane had her own pattern, but Stephen, 3 years older, was very assertive and resisted his father and fought with him quite a lot. And it became Stephen's mission to want to get him stopped and to gather information against him and turn him in and tell him so maybe someone will make him stop. And in this mission, he enlisted Diane and told her, you have to help me. You're good at remembering things. You have to remember everything. And she's like, okay, I will, little Diane. And so coming forward to the episode, I'm going to tell you here, and this is the episode where Diane did tell. She told. Okay. First of all, we've got a powerful programming of don't tell. You understand that part. The other part is you want to tell. And both of these have a program built into them for Diane, and I'm sure for Stephen, which is if you tell, someone will die. If you don't tell, someone will die. This puts you in a double bind. It creates a constant stress. It's like those mechanisms I mentioned earlier. They operate without any intervention, and it operates for life. It's a program. Okay, so she's under this talk, don't talk programming, and she's in school, and the mom decided she needed to go to a Catholic school, so they had nuns, and they were talking about the 10 Commandments, and she raises her hand and says, well, what if your father's a soldier and he kills people? And the nuns fight back, and they say, well, of course they have to go to confession, but God forgives them. And then she comes back, well, what if he kills people when there's not a war? And the nun's like, well, soldiers have to kill. It's their job. And then she won't stop. What if a soldier kills women and children? And then the nun calls a recess and pulls her and tells her she has to forgive her father, stop worrying. And then Diane says, he kills women. He kills children. And I've watched him do it. And then a nun says, no. And she's like, I've seen him torture them. This cannot be true. I've watched him bury them. No, you're lying. I know where they're buried. So sister grabs her, and they say, we're going to see father. Have you got any brothers and sisters in this school? Yes, I have Stephen. So go get Stephen. And they bring her, and they bring Stephen into father's office, and father's there, and he say, oh, God, they tell me you're disturbed, and of course your father's a good soldier. We straight on that. And she just looks him in the eye and says, my father kills children. I've watched him. And father screams, no, you have not. And he finally he says to Stephen, do something with her. She's your sister. And Stephen finally turns to her and he says, she's telling the truth. And he says, get him out of here. Call their parents. So Mom.
Wait a minute. So these two children just admit of what they've seen in the first responses, send them home to those same parents?
It's not just the first when it goes on. This is what the book is about. This entire book is about trying to report this. And so Mom picks her up and says, okay, we won't tell Dad, we won't tell Dad. And so for a while everything's quiet. But what happened is the priest told the army and the army told Dad. And Dad dragged her and Stephen out of bed in the middle of the night, marched him out into the woods where he built a fire. And he had Diane's teddy bear, her stiff bear that was her closest confidant and took care of her and that she loved as she wanted to be loved. And he had him there on the edge of the fire and he was starting to smolder. And Dad says, I'm going to burn your eyes out for what you've seen. I'm going to burn your tongue out for what you said. And then he lectured Stephen on how it was all his fault because he failed to keep Diane quiet. And then he started demonstrating with the teddy, and he picked him up, he ripped him apart, and he had to pull the hot poker from the fire and burned the bear. And then he was laughing maniacally and just glaring at Diane, and then he lunged at her, he grabbed her by the hair, and he pulled her head back. And just as he aimed that hot poker at her eye, Stephen jumped into the fire pit, and he kicked the bear out of the fire. Dad threw his aim off enough, and Diane jerked enough that the hot poker only struck her in the neck, which it burned her very severely, and she carries the scar to this day. He threw her down, and she hit the ground trying to get away. Stephen took off one way. She took off another. She commented to me about this just yesterday, that was the training from the program, to go in different directions. And she pulled herself up, and then he hit her on the back of the skull with a shovel and knocked her out. And she was left there in the leaves, in the woods, left for dead. The father covered her up with brush and left her there, and she was there for 16 hours.
Oh.
Stephen had run off and gone home. Dad went away. And finally she realized she was alive, and it was time for dinner, and so she came home. And Mom was shocked to see her, and you better stop running off in the woods like that. It just upsets your father. You could get hurt doing that. Okay, she's walking up with this gross wound on her neck. She's filthy. She's been out all night and all day, and she looks like a corpse. And the abuse she gets from her mother is that Dad's really going to be mad.
Well, why is obviously the father doesn't want to be outed and doesn't want that, but murdering his child or the child going missing, that didn't seem to register to him that's going to be a huge red flag, and it's going to be hard, to not draw attention and people looking into his life a lot more deeply.
He carried, even though they were poor, he carried insurance policies on each one of those children. And he would threaten them and threaten the mother. Whenever anyone failed to or showed signs of not being loyal, he would say, okay, I guess it's time to cash in another one of these policies.
Had he been this broken before? It sounded like he was devastated by what he had been forced to do before, but doing this to your own children.
Yes, correct. And I'm trying, I'm limited by time, so I just wanted to walk you through one sequence that's typical there of him with the children and what the witness faces when trying to tell. And it goes through levels throughout the whole book of telling the military on up until Diane and Stephen are in their teens and early 20s and going in a meeting with the FBI and telling the FBI. And then there was trying to tell this on the documentary. It's all a matter of trying to tell this story. All right, so let me just say that this is a very expert perpetrator, and there's something that I call the undetectable serial killer. Okay, this is not a guy like Danny Rowling, a hapless, hallucinating drifter. He just wanted to be caught and punished. This was a family man with dual citizenship embedded in the military. He was a skilled and mature and professional perpetrator. He selected his victims very carefully, and he considered himself a past master of corpse disposal. Now, whatever he was doing on orders for the program he was in, we are not able to discover that, but we do know that he would disappear for long periods of time. He was not AWOL. He was still employed by the Army, but he would not discuss it. We do know that he would undergo drastic personality changes, and we do know that he had a taste for recreational murder on the side.
But yet no charges were ever filed against this guy.
There were incidents where it became very... He was witness shooting at Diane and Stephen by a guard. A guard witnessed him shooting at Diane and Stephen out on the target practice, and caught up with him and wrote him a ticket and warned him and told him he was being written up and that he was going to be watched. Well, that takes up almost half of the book to describe what happened to him, to that guard, and what happened to Stephen when Stephen held on to the guard's shoe and let his dad know that he had that shoe. And that takes up about half of the book. So it's not that that it was completely without notice, and there were interventions. I don't think we'll have time really to go into the MKUltra lab stuff, but I will just mention this tie-in. In that the children were taken out of the program not because of anything they had done, but because of the way their father behaved. And he was, he was not just profoundly evil. He was also a jerk, and coming in there in the lab and stealing equipment, and they knew it was him, and then trying to get money for his kids being in the program. And they're telling him, we're putting it in a fund for their college. And he said, well, they're not going to college. This is their college, and I want the money now, and causing trouble like that. That's why they were taken out of the program.
All right, we have to take a break, and we'll come back. If you have some questions for our guests, you can certainly be a part of the show. We'll continue hearing some of the story. And I do want to hear some of the MKUltra lab information. I mean, we have a half an hour to share together with this crime. But then how did these kids finally break away from this and not end up dead? We'll focus on that and more when we return. Sondra London, our guest here on Coast to Coast AM. Thank you for tuning in and being a part of my world. I'll be back with you again at the end of October, and I hope you'll join me for the final weekend of October, leading into the Halloween weekend. I'll be bringing the scary. I'll find some great paranormal guests to share with you as we usher in All Hallows Eve that weekend. So I'll look forward to it. I hope you'll be here with us. And we're going to be doing our Halloween for Hunger campaign. We've partnered up with George Norrie, Lisa, Tom, and Coast to Coast AM to help raise money for Second Harvest Heartland, to help feed the needy right here in our country, in America's heartland. Every dollar we raise supplies 3
meals for families or people in need. So if we can raise our $15,000 goal, that means we will help usher in 45,000 meals. Think about that. $15,000, 45,000 meals for people in our communities, in our towns that need our help. So if you'd like to help with that, just send me an email, dave@darknessradio.com, and I'll send you a link, and you can make that donation, and any amount helps, truly. There are millions of listeners from Coast to Coast AM. If each of you just donated $1, we would have a massive impact. Our goal this year is just $15,000, but I know that there are so many millions of you out there listening, and it would really help if you could be a part of this, and we could set a brand new massive record. So if you're interested in even just donating $1, email me, dave@darknessradio.com, and help Coast to Coast AM and Beyond the Darkness continue to give back to the people in the communities that listen to the show and support us through love and light. So we want to thank you very much for doing that and being a part of our world. All right, we're going to come back and we'll begin taking your calls. We'll continue talking about the MKUltra labs and more when we return here on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to the best in overnight talk radio. This is Coast to Coast AM, filling in for George Norrie. I'm Dave Schrader, and my guest this evening, Sondra London. Walk us through the MKUltra labs and some of the stories involved in that. I know you don't have a whole lot of time on it, but it is something I think people are going to have an interest in.
Just try to zoom through this now. Of course, we know that Project MKUltra was funded right there in 1953. Stephen was born in 1951. Diane was born in 1955. And before MKUltra, we also had Project Artichoke and Project Bluebird going back to 1950. So that gives us a little bit of a time frame on the programs that were in play at the time. When Diane and Stephen were brought into their experience of the program, it was at Fort Devens, and it was 1961 that the two kids were taken into the program. So what they did was go down to a building on base, which they were told was a clinic, but when they got there, there was no sign clinic, and it wasn't the usual clinic they'd gone to before. It looked like a portable. So we went into this building, and then the difference became when they began to go down a spiral flooring into an underground facility, which was the lab. None of the goings-on that went down there went on above. Above, it was just a little wood-framed building where they would go in, and then below was the lab. Well, Diane herself was into those that program for about a year and a half there, at the age of 6 to 7. The purpose of the program, ultimately, of course, is to identify and activate actual assassins, people who will kill on command. And so at some point in the training that they undergo and the testing that they undergo, candidates are sorted out. In the first place, who are the candidates who are taken into this program? And when Diane and Stephen were, their father, of course, tried to promote, well, I've got these other kids too, you know. And they're like, no, we know about your children, and these are the only two who are qualified. There were things that had been noticed about Diane before then. But in the lab, they were treated to sort of paramilitary training with athletic type exercises. They were taught to control their breathing and their blood pressure. And then in these sessions that Diane related to me, they were group sessions, which were like kind of a group hypnosis type thing, where there were other children present, but most of the important work that Diane experienced, she would be taken by herself into a room, which would be equipment or some particular setting.
Were they chosen because they would be easy to manipulate because they were already so fragile from what they were seeing and dealing with their father?
I'll bet. Because other children that have been taken into the program that I've interviewed, yes, they were the products of abuse. Some of them were military. Several of them were parents were in atomic energy. One boy, mother was a professor at Columbia, and father was a police captain. So there we get children that were pre-qualified in some way, make it a little bit easier. And, of course, all along the way, people were sorted out. And there comes a chapter in the book called We Did Not Fail, because that's what Diane was told when they, let her go, that we did not fail. That's not the point. It's just that we reached a certain point in the program with you, and now it's over. But it was very shortly after that the thing was dismantled. And before that happened, with Diane and Stephen being terminated from the program, there were also signs of shakiness there at the lab, within the lab, with the personnel, that there began to be segments that didn't approve of what was being done, and dissension among them. And then there was an actual stand down that was with guns drawn by opposing parties there about whatever they were doing. So things weren't really going that well, and it was not long after that that this program was dismantled. But
wouldn't you think that they would have killed these two children because they knew too much? There was something going on. You think they would have disappeared them at some point?
No, it wasn't like that. And the work in the lab really didn't seem to have anything to do with their dad. And there was work with remote viewing and remote with psychic ability. Developing the psychic ability in the remote viewing, and these were the things that Diane was tested on when her powers were demonstrated before the visiting doctors. And they had the big scene where, they made her locate things at a remote location and reveal all kinds of information, and she said it was just like the feeling part of her was paralyzed, and only the part that knew what to do was in control. And that scene was quite dramatic, and in which Stephen actually played a starring role at the end, and so that gets back, and I don't really want to spoil the fun of reading the book. I mean, what happened. But that sets the scene pretty much. They always wanted to qualify sooner or later any candidate on the issue of, would they kill? And the point is that try to put it different ways. And would they kill for their mother? Would they kill for their priest? Would they kill for their country? Would they kill, whatever? But here's what happens with the hypnosis involved is whenever any kind of admission or any kind of possibility might be admitted, then that qualification can be met hypnotically, if you follow me.
Okay, to a degree, yeah.
However,
it's very convoluted in a lot of this, right?
With insurmountable moral structures within their personality or all of their personalities, this could not be surmounted. And that person would then be shunted off into a different program.
Okay. And how did they eventually get away and break through from all of this and get away from this abusive family and father? But from their family.
Father being a jerk.
Okay, but how did they get away from the father who was already threatening to murder them and do horrendous
survived,
things?
And there's a really strange development toward the end of the book where, as an adult, Diane actually comes back and moves back in the house with her mother who's dying and her father who's no better than he ever was, and brings her daughter. So that's a whole nother thing. But how did they survive these mortal encounters? And then there was more than one. He had tried to drown Diane. He did poison her. And it's several really terrible occasions that occurred. And me working with Diane and having a conversation at one point, I'm just, even though I knew how everything went, this is years along, and I just said, how could you even survive? And she boiled it right down, and she said it was the lady. It was divine intervention, because the lady would appear, and the lady would intervene, and the lady would protect and console. And this is the blessed spiritual presence. And Diane feels that this is the only reason she's alive today.
It's because of an angelic presence that was making itself known to help.
Yes, and I've heard this before about the lady, that she doesn't appear unless it's under duress, and that she's not to be trifled with, and she's not to be made to appear through ruses or empty ceremonies. But when there's a vital suffering, human suffering, and there's a spontaneous spiritual manifestation, and she's not the only one who's experienced this. I'm not Catholic, and this is not a Catholic book. But I cannot deny that this is a part of the story.
Interesting stuff. Thank you very much for being a part of the show. Sondra London, Good Little Soldiers is the name of the book. We'll have links up to her website and ways for you to find more information.
May I just say the website is goodlittlesoldiers.com.
Yep, goodlittlesoldiers.com. Thank you so much for being a part of the show, Sondra. I also want to thank all of the people involved and behind the scenes on the show. Nathan Staten, Donna Walker back at home office helping to run things right here from our main studios when I host the show at KNSI Radio in St. Cloud. I want to thank Gabe Anderson and, of course, Lisa Lyon and George Norrie for their continued help in allowing me to come in here and sit in. Jeff Mudgett, Sondra London, our guests this evening. I'll be back with you again at the end of October. I hope you'll join us, and please help me in our campaign to help feed the needy right here in the United States through Second Harvest Heartland. You can send me an email at dave@darknessradio.com, and I'll send you a link so you can make a donation and help us with that. Be kind, love one another, and I'll talk to you again at the end of October. I'm Dave Schrader, and this is Coast to Coast AM.